This Playboy bunny was murdered in her London flat in what detectives described as one of the most violent and brutal crime scenes that they had ever worked on. I'm True Crime Caitlin, and this is the murder of Eve Stratford. Eve Stratford was born in Dortmund, West Germany on the 28th of December 1953. Eventually her and her family settled in the UK, and by 1973 she was living in a flat in Leighton, London with her rockstar boyfriend Tony Priest. Eve was described as a very friendly, bubbly, girly girl. She was really sweet, she was very smart, she could speak multiple languages, and she was very soft-hearted. Her dream in life was to become a famous model, and Eve was so beautiful that this was something that was well within her reach. She managed to get a job in the very prestigious Playboy Club in London. Here she would serve drinks, she would chat with patrons, all while wearing the absolutely iconic Playboy bunny outfits. Tails, ears, heels, the lot. Eve absolutely loved this job, and she got along with all of the other women working there. In March of 1975, however, Eve was suspended from this job after her manager discovered that she had posed nude on the front of a competitor's magazine. She was Mayfair magazine's Girl of the Month. This suspension would have been something that absolutely devastated Eve. On the 18th of March 1975, Tony Priest left the Leighton flat early in the morning for a day at work, leaving 22-year-old Eve behind. That day she would trek right over to Camden, where she met with her agent, and then following that she went to the Bayswater area, and this is where she met up with a promotions consultant. Following this, she was spotted heading towards the direction of her home at about 3:30 p.m. She was clutching a bouquet of dried flowers, and this was the final confirmed sighting of Eve Stratford alive. When Tony arrived back home at around about 5:20 p.m, he opened up the door and announced that he was home, only to be met with silence. He walked up the stairs and made his way to the couple's bedroom, and that is when he found Eve. She was laid face down on the floor, partially dressed in only a matching set of underwear and a negligee which was open at the front. Her hands were bound behind her back with a scarf, and there had been an attempt to bind her legs. There was a nylon stocking wrapped around one of her ankles. Horrifyingly, Eve Stratford had her throat slit between 8 to 12 times with so much force and ferocity and violence that she was almost decapitated. It was also later confirmed that she was sexually assaulted, the killer leaving behind a DNA sample. Detectives immediately got to work. They would say that this was one of the most graphic, brutal, violent, horrifying crimes that they had ever worked on, and this man was still on the street and they needed to find him and needed to apprehend him before he could do this again. They would have no idea that they would be too late. Detectives learned that in the days leading up to and on the day of her murder, Eve had been receiving really strange, eerie phone calls. Someone would ring her phone and she would answer saying, "Hello?" But then on the other end, there would just be silence. There was no sign of forced entry into the flat. However, there was evidence that made the detectives believe that Eve was intercepted as soon as she walked into her home. She had been caught off guard by her killer, who likely was laying in wait, ready to ambush her as soon as she walked through the door. Eve's downstairs neighbour was home the entire time. She told the detectives that she didn't really hear anything. At one point she heard Eve talking to a man, but she couldn't really hear or wasn't really listening to what they were saying because it wasn't as if they were shouting and they were screaming. It was just like a normal general conversation. Following this, she heard a single thud followed by footsteps and then silence. That was about an hour before Tony arrived home. He would be ruled out as a suspect, and the detectives began going through every single avenue that they could. They extensively looked into a man named Abdul, who was a regular at the Playboy Club. But he too would eventually be ruled out. They started to wonder if maybe Eve had a stalker, maybe someone else from the Playboy Club, or maybe someone who had saw her Mayfair magazine cover and wanted her all to themselves. Detectives would take over 400 statements, they fingerprinted over 250 people, but no matter what they did and what tip they followed, they got no closer to identifying Eve's killer. Back then, even with the DNA sample, there wasn't a lot that they were able to do with it. And so, her case began to go cold. It wouldn't be until 30 years later that something happened that blew open the case. They had finally got a match to the DNA sample, but it wasn't a match to a person. This DNA sample matched another DNA sample that was found at another crime scene. The same man who brutally murdered Eve Stratford inside of her home murdered 16-year-old Lynn Whedon only 6 months later. And it took 30 years for DNA to link these two cases. Many people who are familiar with this case don't think that the killer stopped at just Eve and Lynn, that he went on killing. There are at least 3 other murders of women and girls in London who could be connected to these cases. The case of those 3 women I am going to be featuring on this Friday's episode on my podcast, True Crime with Caitlin. If you're interested in hearing about the case of Eve Stratford and Lynn Whedon in its entirety, going through the girls' backgrounds, the murders, the investigations, suspects, everything and more, I have covered in a brand new podcast episode ready to listen to right now wherever you stream on the True Crime with Caitlin podcast.